Well, the life in Paris was seductive, and I think I wanted then, and I still want to be there. I've gone back every opportunity. There haven't been as many as I had hoped, but so I stayed I stayed after the book was done, and up until the very end of the summer. But in the course of that summer, in the course of writing the book, something very unpleasant happened. I was drafted into the United States Army, and or at least there was a lottery in those days, and my number was so low, it was inevitable that I was going to be taken into the forces, and there was really only two ways of avoiding it. One was to declare myself gay and inappropriate to be recruited, or go do a PhD program in the United States. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many, active intellectuals of those days ended up taking PhDs. Is that everybody, in order to avoid the Vietnam, ended up in school. I've always wondered, that was always been an interesting thing, because you had two choices in those days: do a PhD or go to Canada, or both. And I actually ended up doing both. But so I was very fortunate in that a couple of professors were able to get me into Princeton. It was the first year of Princeton's anthropology program, and so I did escape Vietnam, and I also, though certainly was a very painful process, and escaping it, and I began a PhD in anthropology, having studied with Lévi-Strauss. It gave me a very fine, and in his seminar, it gave me a very fine recommendation to get into the program. So that's what I did, and was there for a couple of years. As I said before, I was never. It was never my destiny to be an anthropologist. I was just simply following a path that was largely determined, partly by my fascination with structuralism, partly by my interest in justice, but also partly because of the United States political involvement in Vietnam. I mean, that's what drove me into Princeton. And to be perfectly honest, though the profs there were good, and I appreciated them very much, and they were very kind to me. Many of them had been trained at the University of Chicago under Geertz, and it was kind of a branch office of the symbolic school of anthropologists, this rising symbolic school of anthropologists. This is why they took me, because they figured Lévi-Strauss was part of it. So here was this guy who had been in his seminar, and Nur Yalman, Clifford Geertz. And Clifford Geertz had by that time moved to Princeton with his wife, Hildred Geertz. So that's what the department was, in addition to being interested in carrying on the British tradition as well. So and some religious theories of religion. So that became my life for a couple of years. And I have to say that it was interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to follow what I had done with Bellandier and Lévi-Strauss, but without that. But that's what gave me inspiration, those guys, not what was at Princeton at the time. Though, and I can say a word. If this opportunity will permit me, I've although it's a bit maybe it's a bit inappropriate because of his stature, but I've always felt that Clifford Geertz was a bit of a sham. He was a marvelous writer, but a very arrogant writer. And after having worked in some of the areas that he's worked in, his writing was so florid, and in a way he was so self-compelled by his own writing that sometimes I just felt it was too much. So I didn't really I didn't really find a great deal of inspiration from the people of that era, and particularly of what Princeton had become, which was, a succursale of Chicago. Although it's a wonderful university and inspirational in so many other departments, that it was great. But during my time there, I did find some authors that I found to be absolutely life-changing, and I don't know why, but and it isn't because I'm a Francophile, because I'm not, but most of them were French. Most of the guys most of the anthropologists or the writers, maybe I call them social scientists, that I really was became attached to, and was really inspired by, were French by origin. And I would mention, first of all, because you mentioned you'd like to hear about this, is Louis Dumont. Homo Hierarchicus, I think, was one of the most intelligent books on any subject I have read in a long time, and I've always and I deeply appreciated it. I would mention certainly my reading of Roland Barthes, but for different reasons. Michel Foucault for different reasons mainly, but and then those British anthropologists who had spared themselves, who had defrocked themselves from British anthropology, like Mary Douglas and Edmund Leach, they were great. And so these were the people that. But I have to say that it was through reading Dumont that I began to see how important it was to understand the origins of market economies and the social configurations that they created. So it was from Dumont that I became very, very interested in understanding Marxism. Of course, when you're in Paris and you're in the midst of a revolt, what was if you were going to be, I was sort of part of the Fédération d'étudiants révolutionnaires. These were Maoists, so you read Mao, you read Marx, but because it was fun and it was pertinent. And intellectually, to understand Marx and Rosa Luxemburg and the tradition and Lenin, this was wonderful. And then to bring it back to anthropology, there was Godelier. So while I don't want to say that I was overly influenced by these French anthropologists, they certainly had a major impact on the way I thought. And I was able to maintain my interest in Lévi-Strauss and stayed close to Lévi-Strauss and to be perfectly honest, and what I didn't mention before, while I was in Paris, there was another course being taught in the ambit, if you will, of structuralism by a guy named Luc de Heusch. And I was very fond of Luc de Heusch. Whereas Lévi-Strauss, well, a guy like me is not going to talk to Lévi-Strauss every day. You're not going to have an opportunity to have an interpersonal exchange with him, although I did see him a couple of times in his laboratoire. But Lévi-Strauss but Luc de Heusch was very friendly and was very open. And we had coffee a couple of times. And he said, do be in touch. And he heard that I was trying to write a thesis on Rwanda. And he was really extraordinary. He was an extraordinary mind and had been doing stuff bringing Lévi-Strauss to Africa, and that was a great inspiration for me. So those were the guys who really put my brain together for a while. And I have to say that with Lévi-Strauss, the background, Godelier, Dumont, I was able to bring together the trends, the two separate trends that I had started in Paris, studying with Lévi-Strauss on the one hand and Ballandier on the other, because Luc de Heusch put them together. He was very sympathetic with Ballandier and with contestation and things like that, and with the tensions in class relations, both in modern economies as well as in traditional economies, and so that's what I ended up doing. I was eager to get through Princeton as quickly as possible. I was kind of eager to get out of the United States. I mean, not really, but it was always in the back of my mind. And so I was able to get a very nice fellowship to do a study of what I had always planned to do, a study of what was going on the fringes of the Rwandan kingdom. During the very long historical tradition of the rule of the Mwamis in Astrida and in the kingdom of Rwanda. So that's what I did, and I got a scholarship to do field work in Africa, and to do it in northern Rwanda and southern Uganda, which was the extreme limits of the Rwandan kingdom. And there were many people at that time who were doing it, who were studying this thing. Many of them had been inspired by Ballandier, Alison Desforges. There was Kathy Newberry, and all of us had been influenced by French anthropologists, but we all did our PhDs in the United States, so that's what got me onto my first phase of fieldwork, to go to northern Rwanda. It was a momentous year, needless to say. It was the first real book that I've really had undertaken, and I have learned since that books are no joke. They are tough, particularly if you want to make a career of doing them. It's something which is very difficult. But it was a great experience, and I did some work in the archives at Tervuur in Belgium, and then I spent a few months in the archives in the Padre Bianchi at the Vatican, and then moved on to continue in northern Rwanda. And it was very difficult. So that brings me to that stage.
Who was your supervisor? I forgot to ask.
Well, he was a guy who was not much older than me, a very young whiz kid. His name was Martin Silverman, a graduate of Harvard, but who had studied with Gertz. One of those guys, one of those symbolic anthropology guys who realized, like I did, that this isn't that interesting, and so he kind of let me do what I wanted. But he was only because by that time I was in my late 20s, and he was maybe 30 or in his early 30s, and so really we were pretty much contemporaries. And it was very interesting because at the same time, Martin, of course, saw the world very much like many other people in those days, in the late 60s and early 70s. And when I told him, as my PhD began to come to an end, when I told him that I was going to take a job elsewhere, and preferably in Ontario, he said, well, what do you think about the possibility of us doing it together? I said, okay. And so Western, which was a very good and new department here, hired me, and the year after they hired him. So it actually happened, strangely enough. But Martin moved here, and he was very good, and he's a very clever guy, and he taught here for a few years, and then he went off to become the chairman at British Columbia. So that's what happened. And you might have heard of him, but he didn't leave a huge mark on anthropology in Canada. And but he was my advisor. I think the next step in a lot of this, and to get the bare bones and the skeleton of a kind of a life in anthropology, would be to say a word about fieldwork. Yeah. The fieldwork was complicated by the fact that my main concern was the concern that had been inspired by Ballandier, and that is the instability of Rwanda kingdom, and of these great kingdoms that everybody assumed were stable and powerful and dominant, but they weren't. And so here I was on the fringe of the old Rwandan kingdom in 1970-71, and there had already begun, after the introduction of Rwanda, or the decision by Rwanda in 1968 to become an independent state under the Hutu regime, and there was already killings between Hutu and Tutsi. So I was caught up in that tension, and that was difficult. I was studying a cult called Nyabingi, which was quite famous in those days because it had organized people ever since the 1920s. It had organized opposition to the Rwandan kingdom, and in fact had been responsible for a revolt which killed 20, 30, 40 at a time white Muzungus in Uganda and in Rwanda, rose up and killed them. It had become the inspiration for the Rastafarians. It was very well known around the world for being a cult of true opposition, a cult of protest. And it was inspired by the symbol that inspired it was a symbol of fertility, a woman. And interestingly enough, so it was a bit scandalous, and interesting enough, one of the leaders of the cult happened to be the disenchanted wife of one of the Rwandan Mwamis, Kigeli V. No, the one before that. Her name was Muhumuza. So it was quite a story that people in the North knew about and were not really that eager to talk about. And I really learned about doing political fieldwork, or fieldwork that has a political implication. And I, ever since then, I've done many, many consultancies since then. And I now find myself frequently in these circumstances. And I'm good with them, I guess, but I'm not happy about them. And I mean, they're tough. At one point in the course of the fieldwork, a local priest, Nyabingi priest, decided that I should be killed. And so they put overnight, I think this is what happened, a rabid animal in my house. And as you might expect, I got up in the morning and I was bitten. And so that was a tough experience. And I could tell that this animal was sick, and probably, although we could never do an analysis, because by the time I was so far from the capital city in Kigali that the animal was going to be dead by the time I got there. It just wasn't worth the trouble. So I had to go down to the capital city and get inoculations against rabies. In those days, the minimum number to give yourself, or you had to take, was 32. So the choice was whether to stay in the capital city of Kigali and go to the hospital every day where they would give me a subcutaneous injection. You had to do it every day for 32 days, or to do it by myself, to give it to myself. So I decided to do it for myself. I got 32 needles, I got enough vaccination for 32 days in a big bottle. And I have to tell you that one of the unusual things was that I spoke rather good French and rather good Kinyarwanda, so I got along okay, but I was not that fluent in those days. And so I gave myself 32 vaccinations in the stomach and did it outside every day so everybody could see me. Made a big deal about it, about how I'm not going to get killed by your forces or by whoever the forces are. A little crazy in those days, right? This was a little bold. So I did it. And then I think toward like the 20th shot or something like that, so almost a month had passed, I looked on the bottle and it said, I didn't know what the word périmé meant. And then I began to think, well, maybe I better look this up. It said périmé, and then it gave a date. And the date had been passed 6 months ago. So I said, oh my God. And so I had to go back to the capital city and get a whole new set of vaccinations. And so I ended up giving myself almost 50-some vaccinations in the stomach, day after day after day. And during which time I got malaria. So, I mean, I think in some way this might have been typical, but God knows it wasn't pleasant. And it was quite an adventure. But I stuck it out, and I have to say, at the end of the field work, I was quite sick, psychologically and physically, having endured 2 bouts of malaria, various infections, giardia, and so on. And so I'm not so sure that people who go into the field these days ever go quite through the same kinds of things, but maybe they do. But it was quite an adventure. And to know that I could survive that, I guess it's been important to know. I'm not saying I was by no means not a hero. I was scared to death that I was going to die. And the fear of dying, I thought I might die. And the fear of it, and I figured there's nothing I could do. There's no reason to go back home, because if I die, I die. And I always felt that, well, why not stick it out? I've got a pretty good chance, so we'll see what's. But that experience is something that stays with you for quite a long time. So that was quite an adventure. And I must say, though, that in the end, it was very gratifying that Luke and people that I had come to really, really respect, like Jan Vincina, the great Belgian and French anthropologist Georges Ballandier, they really liked the book, and after a few years, I defended my PhD thesis, which really wasn't entirely on this subject, but then I wrote the book, and it was published by Tervuur in Belgium. And it was really quite an experience to purge myself of that experience, and I think that's something that many anthropologists experience. After you finally get the book out that you struggled with for God knows how many years, such a relief. So here, I don't know, you guys want to. This is the infamous book. Very small, but very important to my life. Anyway, that's that brought that time to an end. But I will say that there was something that that was really important to me personally about that, and that is that while many people and many anthropologists, both in Princeton and in other schools that I knew about, and in British anthropology, which was so important, and even the symbolic side of British anthropologists, seemed not to be all that interested in history. My experience with French anthropology had been to make me interested in history, and in social, political, and economic change, not the functional parts of a society and how it operates. That's not how that seemed to me completely not very useful, not very interesting. And it was, and one of the things that really made a big difference, and that has always stuck with me, was a growing interest in inequalities, access to resources, the problem when societies and in social classes do not have access to resources, and that kind of thing. There was the opportunity to come to, I had always wanted to do this, an opportunity to come to Canada. I have a personal attachment, a number of personal attachments. From my very earliest childhood, we have visited Georgian Bay, and my grandfather, however he did it, we won't go into it, but he bought an island, and it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, in my opinion, and I came to love Canada, and I always thought that I was born originally a Canadian, and I might as well just realize what was obviously a fact. So after the PhD, and I got an offer from Western, I didn't hesitate to take it over other things, and so that was I was able to embark on a career. I wasn't really ready for a permanent career, but I figured, hey, this is how things go. And Western was a very fine department in those days, really fine. Had a lot of really good people, many of them from Chicago, and very energetic intellectual environment. And many of the people who had been so influential to me, or on me, including Jen Vincina, Luc Dehoish, Georges Ballandier, still were very much part of my life. That never changed. Much more so than Princeton. These were the guys that I just really enjoyed, and many of the people that I had read under their tutelage. Yeah. So in a way, it became a career, but I wasn't never very sure that this symbolic anthropology was my, cup of tea. And though after all, that's why I was here, so I could teach structuralism, and because I knew it, I'd studied it, and they wanted courses in this kind of thing, in symbolic anthropology, and some of the Dutch anthropologists as well, and marriage alliances, and the parenté and all these marriage structures, and that's what I did. But it didn't, it really wasn't in my heart and soul, to be perfectly honest. And the things that remained from the educations that I had were, I'd say 2 or 3 things, which now that I look back on them, and in this interview has given me an opportunity to think about them, and it's been great. First of all, was a love of writing. And I learned the love of writing quite ironically, partly from reading French and from reading Barthes or from reading Foucault, because they are and Lévi-Strauss. They are marvelous writers. And partly the reason why they are marvelous writers is because they are impeccable logicians. Absolutely impeccable. I love the way a paragraph in Lévi-Strauss is structured. You start off with, geology, and you end up talking about surrealism, and it all makes sense. So that was one thing. I mean, I was also very deeply interested in new journalism as a writing format, but it was wedded to this. It was not so separate. I mean, that was a typical American type of writing. George Plimpton and Tom Wolfe and, those wonderful, crazy, wild 60s writer, Ken Kesey. But, I found a close similarity between the new journalists and and Lévi-Strauss. And I'm sure he would turn over in his grave if he heard me say that. So, I mean, that was one thing that had nothing to do with what I was doing here. And the other thing was what I had learned with Ballandier, and in the last years at Johns Hopkins. I mean, I have always had, for whatever reason, some concern about social justice, and it has permeates my life. And I may not be the most vocal proponent of the disenfranchised, but that's always been part of my intellectual format. I mean, I've always been very concerned about that, and so it really wasn't part of anthropology in those days. The kind of anthropology that you taught. I mean, I taught symbolic anthropology. I taught mythology. I taught structuralism, and sometimes you taught a little bit of British social anthropology and ritual, and Victor Turner, whom I did not like at all because it was so boring, but it was always there. This concern about how do societies become unstable and what happens then, and how do you resolve those issues and things like that. To be perfectly honest, I lasted for 25 years at Western, which was way too long. I mean, I went well beyond my time, because my interests had began to range rather widely, and I'm not proud of it by any means. It's just who I am. The words eclectic definitely come to mind and have been used in my case. Sometimes dilettante, but I began to I was interested in a lot of different things, not all of them associated with run-of-the-mill anthropology. I stayed here, taking various jobs and for a long time, but not. My heart was not all here. A number of things happened during this time, because I had become because I was really looking for other things to do, actually. And in a way, I think the department was a little bit frustrated. I worked very hard in the department. I taught hard. I was very committed to being involved in world anthropology and putting Canada's place in it. And I worked with Marc Tremblay and all these marvelous people from Quebec on that matter, and Cyril Belshaw with all his craziness. It was all great, but my heart really wasn't in it. So I did a couple of things. I mean, I couldn't really turn loose of Roland Barthes. And I remembered often, and I was looking for a way of experimenting with my writing. And I remembered his essay called Le Catch. I don't know if people remember that, but it was one of his most famous and wonderful essays on professional wrestling, his analysis of professional wrestling. And so I decided that I would write a book on professional wrestling myself. Not entirely inspired by Barthes, more inspired by George Plimpton, I would say, the new journalist. But it certainly had a lot to do with Roland Barthes. And so that was one thing that I did. I undertook in my spare time, I guess you'd call it, to join a wrestling group here in Ontario in the early 1980s. At a time when the WWF was reigning supreme and putting out all the other territories and all the other small. But I loved the carnival atmosphere of local promoters who went town to town in these local arenas and put on these shows, these wonderful, wonderful shows of. And I came to see them, not unlike Roland Barthes, but I don't know if it's coincidental or not. I came to see them as proletarian dramas. And I wrote about them in a very colorful way. And so that was one thing that I did in the 1980s to divert myself, perhaps. I don't know if that's the right word. And the book was called Drawing Heat. And this is something I know you guys want me to show these books, but Drawing Heat was an incredible experience because it happened at a time when the Maple Leaf Gardens, the guys who ran Maple Leaf Gardens, the descendants of Gene Tunney, Frank Tunney and Sons, were running these nasty shows and trying to put out of business these little guys. Well, that's what the whole wrestling thing was about. Little guys being hurt by big guys. And it was a microcosm of the discontent. Again, this idea comes back. This discontent of the disenfranchised in Ontario, the farmers, the workers, with the big boys, how they would never get ahead. So Drawing Heat, that book came out in the mid-1980s and was kind of a literary success. It was well reviewed, Globe and Mail, and got all kinds of attention. But then Peter Zosky got hold of it. Do you know who Peter Zosky is? Peter Zosky was the Sheila Rogers of that era. Peter Zosky was a wonderful, everybody will know him who is in English Canada. Peter Zosky was the most important figure on CBC. And he loved the book, and he had me on a couple of shows. All of a sudden, sales were, I was doing tours and stuff like that. So it was great. And the book went way beyond what it was originally intended to do, and it gave me an opportunity to have a profile a bit as a writer. So that was one thing. And then I made that a little bit a part of it. But I don't think that Western ever, and for good reason, I don't blame them. It wasn't an academic. It was more of a writing exercise, and it was fun. It was social and had relevance socially, but it wasn't an academic piece. And they really didn't know what to do with it when it came time to giving past salary raises. Do they count this as part? Anyway, that was one thing. And I enjoyed it immensely, and it took me in a number of directions, and it got me interested in doing more creative writing, something I had always wanted to do.